Thank you. I wanted to recognize we had a third person who was supposed to be on this panel. Andrew Jeans was going to be here from the province, so we could have some multi-level government conversation. He wasn't able to make it, but I think there's been already some discussion about the provincial role, and we think is a necessary part of this conversation. It's funny, a lot of people said to me today, oh, you're on the panel with Michael, oh, are you going to duke it out? Oh, are you going to, you know. And I said, well, the format doesn't really allow for that because we're not speaking to each other, we're speaking to you. But I think, you know, whenever I hear Michael, whenever we work together, I'm always struck by how similar we are in terms of what we value and what we understand in terms of value, and I think you know, we depart in ways pretty much based on the kind of roles that I think we have. And I don't generally live in the world of intelligent conversation. And so, you know, and I mean that on a daily basis. It's pretty functional. And so the challenge is how to bring the functional into something that is both imaginative, open. I definitely hear we need to be open, we need to push the boundaries, and so this is a really great opportunity here to hear some of that. I like Michael, it's funny, neither of us have slides either, so we're more alike than I thought you'd blow me away with beautiful images. I wanted to go through a bit of a personal history, which is a little bit, speaks a bit to the idea of cultural landscape and how I personally have come to think about it and the sorts of things we're thinking about the City of Toronto. When I started my career as a historian in the late 1990s, I was working for an archaeological consulting firm. And at that time, and as is true today, the bread and butter of the work was doing environmental assessments. So I was doing historical research for archaeological assessments that were taking place. Also, in the environmental assessment process, you have a requirement to do a survey of what they call built heritage features and the cultural heritage landscapes. And while we're talking about this now as if this is something that's kind of an emerging issue, in fact, the Ministry of Transportation set out guidelines for how you would identify built heritage features and cultural heritage landscapes as early as 1990. And so you use that as your sort of baseline book when you're doing the work. So part of that work was about assessing impact. So you had the identification piece, and then you had to understand what the impact was going to be. Eventually, the firm that I worked for, they got tired of contracting out the built heritage work, and so they developed their own in-house group. And with a certain amount of luck and a lot of crash course mentoring, I became, it was the coolest job title I've ever had, manager of the built heritage and cultural landscapes section. And it barely fit on the on my business card, but I loved handing it out because people looked at it and go, what on earth is that? And what I loved doing about that part of my job was that I got to spend about 6 years traveling throughout the province, identifying BHFs and CHLs. And the goal was to identify them so that you could figure out if they were going to be potentially affected by a road widening, a hydro project, activities of the Ministry of Natural Resources, a new highway, or in many cases, my special interest and hobby horse is bridge structures and bridge rehabilitation projects. And there was a sort of standard way to approach this. You did historic research, then you looked at historic mapping, and then you went out to do the field survey. And I became very adept in quickly reading the evidence of change in the landscape, at least in this sort of limited way that you were dealing with kind of defined areas. So I began to know the unique lotting patterns of township designs, the characteristics of different farmsteads that were built by different ethnocultural communities, where someone put the orchard, where someone put the wall, where someone put, all of this was laid out with a kind of background that had an ethnocultural basis. And so part of my job was to document all of that. I identified, of the garden variety, identified roadscapes, railscapes, historic settlements, villages. You're always looking for collections of features. And that's the cultural heritage landscape part. It's about the various interrelationships of various features and what they add up to. And then the community and cultural meaning that falls out of them, not just as individual structures, but as something that express something of the history. Of course, in tandem with that was the archaeological work, which was hand-in-hand working with the idea of the historic archaeological artifacts and also recognizing the importance of the First Nations. So it was sort of a multi-layered process where you understood 10,000 years in one road survey. So it was a fascinating and wonderful history, and some days I long for that job where I jumped in my car with my Labrador retriever and I headed off to Northern Ontario just taking pictures and mapping and mapping. But what it taught me was that we can see these things, which is what we're talking a lot about today. For the most part, it was pretty tidy work. They were all numbered, CHL1, CHL2, had a little boundary, you'd map it, you'd take the road alignment that they were planning, and then the best, it was like completely, almost regulation-free. You'd sit in the environmental planning team and you'd say, if you widen to the left, you can avoid the school that was built in the 1850s. If you widen to the right, you'll have to take out the front porch. So why don't you widen to the left? It was a lovely, satisfying thing to say that you could just leave things alone. The idea was avoid, 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 avoid. And avoid is the first sort of line of conservation. The beautiful thing about avoiding is that you also allow things to continue to evolve in that organic way. You're not stopping it or freezing it in time. You're not saying that in most cases, most landscapes are evolved, and each piece of the story is important, from the early First Nation story right up to the stories that we're adding to them today. But I found the classification of these things quite satisfying, and I felt like I was making a real difference to the various communities who, for the most part, had nobody looking after heritage planning in their municipality, did not necessarily have anything on a heritage register. And so it was this provincial review which was actually providing the opportunity to do some of this background work and thinking about conservation in local communities. Natural extension of that was moving over to the city, where I could deal with the idea of public interest in a more public service-oriented way. And while I was aware of it before I came to the city, I was immediately struck by the extraordinarily litigious nature of land use planning here, which is only to say I wish everything could be dealt with intelligent conversation and with everybody being on the same page and having shared values. But I don't find that in many places in the world, and certainly not in land use planning in Toronto, that this is very much the norm. It exists, and there are lots of extraordinarily visionary people who are doing wonderful city building things in this city. But for every one, you're still having these very difficult conversations about who wants to demolish what. And I hear a lot lately, particularly at places like this, why isn't the City of Toronto doing more? Why aren't they protecting cultural landscapes? Well, the truth is we actually are. And we're just not giving it that label. And I don't think we need the label in order to do that. So in our Part 4 designations, we're not just recognizing the individual building on a property. We are recognizing where the historic entry was, the entry gate, the processional route, where it arrived, landscape features that would have been important to the design of the properties. A number of the properties that are listed on Brendan's list of cultural landscapes identified when the foundation was here are actually Part 4 designated properties. Allen Gardens, Clarence Square, and places like the Garden Court Apartments. So we're working that in. We're also spending a lot of time on making sure that our city planning documents, our urban design guidelines, our public realm studies are all informed by sound historic research and understanding of the evolving character of areas. And you will find public realm plans built into secondary plans that are rooted in a sense of historic view, landmarks, and design, and all of that is coming to the fore because people in the Heritage Group are a part of those studies. So the more we can be a part of the other types of things, the more we can get beyond, I suppose, just strictly speaking, designations under the Heritage Act. But I still think that despite some of the pitfalls in heritage designation when it comes to cultural landscapes, because we don't have any provincial guidance on how we're supposed to be doing it, which means that we're finding, and we have the opportunity to have creative ways to do it ourselves. I think that it would be very irresponsible for us to abandon that as a vehicle. We work in a policy-led land use planning system. That's what the Planning Act says, policy-led. And while the PPS tells you what the matters of provincial interest are, they don't provide the mechanism by which you can actually flag something to review it, to have that intelligent conversation about a loss. So unless you do that, there is no way to know. It's a very functional application. Comes in, you look at the area, what's it hitting? It's the same sort of thing as I was doing with your environmental assessments. So we are spending a lot of time and effort on these heritage conservation district studies. And it's because we recognize that heritage conservation districts are actually, they are a subtype of cultural heritage landscapes. And you saw with Bobby Point, I loved looking at Madeline's presentation, because it reinvigorated me with Bobby Point as we are inundated by petitions against doing a heritage conservation district study there. And as we're inundated by people papering city council with against taking a look at Lawrence Park, an extraordinary designed landscape, cultural landscape in the city, because people don't see the whole anymore, they just see their particular piece of it. So the HCD work is really fundamental in understanding things very broadly, the context, the individual features that make up the whole. And we are now working on ones that are going to be challenging, and it's going to be really interesting. We are working on Kensington Market as an HCD, as you heard. And yeah, who knows, Kathy, it may end up being the one where you're not allowed to use a traditional approach to something, you know, that you have, like, who knows where we're going to land with that. We're studying it now, and the study will tell us what's important. We're listening, we're working with the community, we're going to take in the intangible, and we're going to see how that plays out and whether or not, you know, an ACD plan is going to be the right vehicle, or it might be a piece of a puzzle, maybe a retail, a land use, a bylaw. Like, there's a whole assortment of things. And so our role at the city is to try to figure out how to collect all the tools together to make sure that what the community values is going to be recognized as valuable, and so that we can have that conversation about the change that's going to happen. And from our perspective, it's not an anti-change, anti-growth, anti-anything, except it's anti-loss. It's about losses. It's not about you know, necessarily wanting to shrink wrap things. It's about if you start losing this and this and this and this, and it's sort of the danger of the cultural landscape approach, because when you have the pieces, then the cunning legal mind will say, well, if you have 10 pieces and you lose one of them, you still have 9 pieces. I can still see that cultural landscape. So I can remove this. And you say, well, they work together. It's a system. You can't just take the water wheel out of the mill and say that it's still the same thing. You know, but those are the types of arguments that we have to get into, and we learn a lot through them. And I certainly have lots to learn out of Kathy's experience with Bala, because how that was argued successfully, the intangible uses as cultural heritage value is really, really important to understand, because we're willing to push the boundaries. We're given a structure, and we don't have to use it the way other people expect us to use it. We can use it in the way we need to use it. We will have to define it. The city is going to be creating policies related to this so that everybody will be on the same page. It's not going to be the only way to conserve cultural heritage landscapes in the city, but I think it's a really important way to go, and we'll have a lot to think about coming out of this. And in the next 2 years, unless Mark Warwick gets there first, although now that I know Mark's delivering in 2018, we're charting new territory, and this is the thrilling part of writing policy for people like me who love that sort of thing. But it's in the service of community value, and I think in that, the thoughts of Michael McLeod and Julian Smith and others who understand that there are other ways than just regulation, it's true. But in my world, we do need to have a regulatory framework because that's what we've been given. Thank you.
Thank you.